I have no papyrus, no archaeological evidence. My one document will be the page you have in front of you, if we can treat the Qur'an as a document. And I'll also be drawing heavily on later Islamic historical sources, and I ask you to keep in mind my question from yesterday to Dar about these sources and how one should use them and treat them. I find the final remark in Adria's lecture about staging is an interesting concept and idea. Adoption is the act of establishing a man or a woman as parent to someone who is not his or her natural child. Adoption practices are found in many human societies, and the roots of the institution can be traced back to the beginnings of recorded history. These practices are in large part a response to the problems of childlessness and parentlessness. Adoption was commonly practiced by the pagans and polytheists of antiquity, including the Greeks, Romans, Hittites, Egyptians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. By contrast, the Israelites preferred to solve the problem of childlessness through the institution of yibum, or levirate marriage, while the Persians solved the problem through the institution of sture, or substitute successorship. Adoption reportedly, that's my sources, late sources, was practiced by the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula throughout the 6th century of the Common Era and during the first quarter of the 7th. The Arabic word for adoption is tabanni, literally to make someone a son. Prior to the rise of Islam, the inhabitants of Arabia are said to have adopted captives, runaways, slaves, and the children of concubines. Both men and women adopted children, but only male adoptees are mentioned in the sources. The adoptee would take the name of his adoptive father or of his adoptive mother, patronymic or matronymic. As elsewhere in the Near East, adoption created mutual rights, mutual inheritance rights, and mutual support between the adoptive parent and the adoptee. Thus, by means of this legal fiction, an adopted child acquired the same legal status as a biological child. Adoption was practiced on the eve of the rise of Islam, and then for approximately 15, 16, 17 years following Muhammad's receipt of his first revelation and emergence as a prophet in the year 610. Details are sparse, and for the most part, we have only the names of a handful of companions of the prophet who were adoptees. But then, suddenly, in the year 5 after the Hijrah to Medina, which is the year 627 of the Common Era, the practice of adoption came to a screeching halt. And you have the text in front of you from chapter 33 of the Qur'an. The Qur'an at the top, verse 4 begins, God has not put two hearts inside any man, nor has he made your adopted sons your real sons. And it continues by instructing believers to call children after their true fathers. These Quranic pronouncements were confirmed by a statement attributed to Muhammad himself. Quote, there is no adoption in Islam. The legal order or the legal regime that preceded Islam has been superseded. End quote. The Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet served as the foundation of the jurisprudence that would develop over the course of the following centuries. The earliest Muslim jurists classified adoption as a prohibited act. The technical term is ḥarām, and according to Islamic law, adoption remains a prohibited act down to the present time. One wonders, why this sudden turnaround in the year 5 after the Hijrah? What were the underlying historical causes of the sudden termination of the practice of adoption? The Muslim commentators, the Muslim exegetes who comment on the aforementioned Quranic verses, state that adoption was abolished because the pre-Islamic practice of equating the sanctity of a stranger with that of a blood relative is barbaric and unnatural. For the most part, Western social historians tend to follow the lead of the Islamic sources. And they explain the abolition of the practice in the context of societal and familial considerations. For example, one scholar has recently attempted to situate the abolition of adoption within the framework of the Qur'an's introduction of a new familial order in which tribal affiliation was giving way to the nuclear family. In that context, adoption might have interfered with the connection between kinship and the inheritance of property. Why should an adopted child inherit on a basis of equality with the biological child? At the same time, so the argument runs, adoption threatened to undermine the incest prohibitions established in the Quran, elsewhere in the Quran. Under a regime in which adoption is practiced, it's conceivable that a male adoptee might unwittingly engage in illicit sexual relations with his biological mother or sister. I maintain that the termination of adoption had little or nothing to do with social or familial considerations or with the relationship between kinship and inheritance. To make my case, I will focus on the career of a man named Zayd, and I hope you'll remember his name, who is mentioned in the Quran in chapter 33, verse 37, where he is identified as the adopted son of none other than the Prophet Muhammad himself. The reference to Zayd in the Quran sparked intense interest in this man among members of the early community of believers, who generated a substantial body of information about him and about his relationship to his adoptive father. I can only summarize some of this rich material about this man named Zayd. Zayd was born sometime around the year 580 in northern Arabia or southern Syria. Around the year 600, when he would have been approximately 20 years old, that is to say, he was already an adult and a man, Zayd was captured by marauding Arab horsemen and taken to the Hijaz, where he was purchased by a wealthy merchant woman named Khadija. Shortly thereafter, Khadija married a man named Muhammad, the man who would soon emerge as the prophet. At the time of the marriage, Khadija gave the slave to her husband as a gift for 700 silver coins. Meanwhile, back in his homeland, wherever that was, Zayd's father, a man named Haritha, was inconsolable after learning of the loss of his son. By a stroke of good fortune, he learned that Zayd was living in Mecca, albeit as a slave. The father set out for Mecca with the intention of ransoming his son and reuniting him with his family. He tracked down his son's slave master, Muhammad, and offered to pay him whatever sum he might want. In response to this generous offer, Muhammad, who remember had not yet received his first revelation, devised a test. Zayd himself would choose whether to return to his home with his father and to be reunited with his mother, or to remain as a slave in Mecca with his master. Whatever the outcome, it was important to Muhammad that Zayd should make the decision of his own free will. Apparently, a close bond, suhbah, had been established between master and slave. And Muhammad reminded Zayd of this companionship, this close bond between the two men. Remarkably, Zayd chose slavery over freedom, thereby inverting a well-known biblical topos. As Zayd put it, Muhammad was the equivalent, in his mind, of both his mother and his father. Following this demonstration of absolute loyalty, Muhammad took Zayd to the Kaaba, where he first manumitted his slave, and then adopted him as his son, a tabanni, in a formal ceremony performed in the presence of witnesses, including his father and his uncle, Zayd's father and uncle, who gave their blessing to the new arrangement. Mutual rights of inheritance were created between Muhammad and Zayd, and Zayd's name was changed to Zayd, the son of Muhammad. Note well, Zayd was now Muhammad's son, adult son and heir. Shortly after adopting Zayd, Muhammad received his first revelation and began his prophetic mission. Zayd was a key, but in my opinion, little known figure in the early community of believers. He was either the first person to become a believer or the first adult male and third person overall to join the community. His nickname, the prophet called him, he was known as the beloved of the messenger of God. In Mecca, he married a woman named Ayman, lucky lady, herself a dark-skinned Abyssinian woman who had been Muhammad, presumably a slave at some point herself, who had been Muhammad's caretaker after his parents died. Around the year 613, Ayman gave birth to a child, a boy whose name would have been Usama, the son of Zayd, the son of Muhammad. Note that Usama was Muhammad's grandson, although he's never identified as such in any Islamic source of which I am aware. Usama was known as the beloved son of the beloved of the messenger of God. Muhammad reportedly was solicitous of his grandson's welfare, dressing him in royal garments and adorning him with jewelry. On important occasions, such as the conquest of Mecca and the farewell pilgrimage, it was Usama who rode directly behind the Prophet as his second in command. Following the hijrah to Medina, in year 622, Zayd informed his father that he wanted to marry a second woman, a beautiful woman by the name of Zainab. Zainab, the daughter of Jahsh. At first, Muhammad rejected the idea on the grounds of the social gap between his adopted son, who was a former slave, and Zainab, who, on her mother's side, shared a grandfather with the Prophet, Abdul-Talib. Undeterred, Zayd asked Ali ibn Abi Talib to intercede on his behalf with the Prophet. Surely, Zayd said, Zayd has a voice, so here we have a slave with a voice, he will not turn you down. Ali went to see the family of this woman, and as Zayd had anticipated, Ali went to see Muhammad, and as Zayd had anticipated, the Prophet relented. Muhammad now designated Ali as his trusted agent and sent him to the house of Jahsh to deliver the marriage proposal. Jahsh was nowhere to be seen and presumably was dead. For this reason, Zainab's brother, Abdullah, served as his sister's marriage guardian. Both Abdullah and Zainab objected to the marriage proposal. Abdullah objected on the grounds that Zayd was a former slave. Zainab objected on the grounds of her physical beauty and social status. I am the most perfect woman in the tribe of Quraysh, she's reported to have said. The impasse in the marriage negotiations was settled by God, who now delivered the revelation that would become verse 36, which you can find on your sheet of Surah Al-Ahzab. When God and his, which reads as follows, when God and his messenger have decided a matter, it is not for any believing man or believing woman to have any choice in the affair. Whoever disobeys God and his messenger has gone astray in manifest error. Once Zainab had been informed about this revelation, she had no choice, as the verse states, but to obey. Obediently, albeit no doubt reluctantly, she became Zayd's wife. The the marriage was not a happy one. Zaynab may have been beautiful, but she had a sharp tongue, and she regularly berated her husband for his domestic failings. It was not long before Zayd began to complain to his father about his wife's behavior. Seeking to repair the marital bond, Muhammad paid a visit to the couple with the intention of admonishing his daughter-in-law. As it happened, perhaps this was another act of God, only Zaynab was at home when the prophet arrived at their house. And we are told she was wearing only a thin garment. She apparently was praying, and as she rose to her feet, the prophet caught a glimpse of her, أَبْصَرَهَا قَائِمَةً, and was immediately transfixed by her beauty and her figure. As one commentator puts it, she was beautiful and white of skin, one of the most perfect women of Quraysh. The prophet immediately fell in love with her, exclaiming, "Praise be to God who has the power to transform the heart of a man in a single instant." When Zayd returned home later that day, Zaynab regaled him with the story of the extraordinary encounter with her father-in-law. Relations between husband and wife went from bad to worse. According to Zaynab, Zayd suffered from a sexual dysfunction, and as a result, the couple ceased having sexual relations. It's a key narrative detail. Staging. In a dramatic reversal, the man who had begged his father for permission to marry Zaynab now pleaded with him for permission to divorce her. Curiously, Muhammad, who was himself in love with the woman, instructed his son not to divorce his wife, keeping his feelings for Zaynab close to his heart. The lovesick prophet's dilemma was resolved by yet another act of God, who now delivered the revelation that would become verse 37 of Surah Al-Ahzab. This verse opens with God's instruction to his prophet to recall a recent conversation with, quote, "the one on whom God and you yourself have bestowed favor." Elsewhere in the Qur'an, the language of divine favor, ni'mah, is used, among other things, with reference to earlier prophets, the one on whom God and you yourself have bestowed favor. In verse 37, the doubly favored man is Muhammad's adopted son, whose name, at the moment when this verse was revealed, would have been Zayd, the son of Muhammad. Although in the Qur'an, he's identified only as Zayd, and for good reason. The subject of the conversation between father and son was the status of Zayd's marriage to his wife, unnamed in the Qur'an, but presumably Zaynab, the daughter of Jahsh. Although Muhammad had fallen in love with Zaynab, he apparently had kept his desire for the woman a secret because he knew that it was a sin for a man to have sexual relations with a woman who either was or had been married to his son. She was his daughter-in-law. Hoping to avert a public scandal, Muhammad instructed Zayd to, in the Quran it says, "Keep your wife to yourself and fear God." The divinity rebuked the prophet for placing his fear of men over his fear of God. God had a better right to be feared by you. But then the divinity introduced a distinction between the wife of a biological son and that of an adopted son. Henceforth, from the moment this revelation was sent down, it would no longer be a sin for a believer to marry the former wife of his adopted son on the condition that the husband was, in the Quran it says, finished with her. That is, on the condition that he no longer had any sexual interest in the woman. Hence the importance of the extra Quranic narrative detail about Zayd's sexual dysfunction. God himself served as the marriage guardian for the union between the prophet and Zainab. We gave her to you in marriage, and the marriage fulfilled the divine command. Although the Qur'an has nothing more to say about this episode, Islamic sources report that Zayd did in fact divorce Zainab, and that Muhammad married her shortly thereafter. In the interval between the divorce and the marriage, the prophet abruptly terminated the filial relationship that had been created approximately 17 years earlier between himself and Zayd. "I am not your father," he said to Zayd. To this, Zayd replied, Zayd, who's absolutely loyal to Muhammad, replied, "O Messenger of God, I'm Zayd, the son of Haritha, and my genealogy is well known and there's no connection to you." Thus did Zayd, the son of Muhammad, the beloved of the Messenger of God, the first person or the first adult male to join the community of believers, the man who, according to the Qur'an, was favored by both God and his prophet, and the only believer apart from Muhammad whose name is mentioned in the Qur'an, lose his status as the prophet's son by adoption and heir. Was it in fact necessary for Muhammad to terminate his status as Zayd's adoptive father? Is it not the case that verse 37 legitimizes the prophet's marriage to Zainab by introducing a distinction between the former wife of a biological son and that of an adopted son? Suppose, for the sake of argument, that Zayd had continued to be Muhammad's adopted son. Would Muhammad have committed a sin or act of disobedience by marrying Zainab after Zayd had divorced her? No, that's precisely what the verse comes to tell us. And there's nothing in the language of this verse to suggest that there would have been any problem with the prophet's marriage to Zainab. In that case, why did Muhammad repudiate Zayd? It was this question, in my view, that triggered a third divine intervention in this episode. The above-mentioned revelations that would become verses 4 and 5 of this chapter. God has not put two hearts inside any man, nor has he made your adopted sons your real sons. Call them after their fathers. Note well, almost immediately after introducing the distinction between biological and adopted sons in verse 37, God abolished the institution of adoption, thereby transforming the distinction between biological and adopted sons into the proverbial distinction without a difference. To this point, God had intervened in history 3 times to direct the course of a domestic episode within the household of the prophet Muhammad. First, to compel a reluctant Zainab to marry her eager suitor, Zayd. Second, to facilitate Muhammad's marriage to Zainab by invoking a distinction between, you know what the distinction is. And then, shortly after this distinction, introducing this distinction, God intervened for a third time to abolish the institution of adoption. But he was not done yet. His fourth and final intervention in this episode, arguably the most important, establishes a fundamental theological principle: Muhammad's status as Khatam an-Nabiyyin, the seal of prophets, the last prophet. Arabic phrase, Khatam an-Nabiyyin. This phrase occurs in verse 40 of Surah Al-Ahzab, which is the 5th verse in a 5-verse unit that stretches from verse 36 to verse 40. I've already discussed 36 and 37. Let me now consider verse 40. Verse 40 reads as follows: Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but the messenger of God and the seal of prophets. God is aware of everything. 3 points merit attention. First, verse 40 is one of only 4 verses in the Qur'an that mentions Muhammad by name. Second, it's the sole textual witness in the Qur'an to the theological doctrine of the finality of prophecy. Had this verse not been included in the Qur'an, one reasonably might conclude that prophecy would have passed from Muhammad to one of his sons, if he had one, and so on down the line. Third, the verse juxtaposes Muhammad's status as the seal of prophets with his sonlessness. The early commentators, when they examine this verse, pay greater attention to Muhammad's sonlessness than they do to his status as the seal of prophets. According to Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, who died in 150 after the Hijrah, the opening clause of the verse refers, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, refers specifically to Zayd, and it establishes that Muhammad is not Zayd's father. Muqatil understood that Muhammad's status as the last prophet is a theological imperative, and he understood that this theological imperative is directly related to Muhammad's sonlessness. Clarify the relationship between Muhammad's sonlessness and his status as the last prophet, the commentator engages in a thought experiment. He begins by positing a general counterfactual. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that Muhammad did have a son who lived to the age of maturity, and that this son outlived his father. What would the status of this son have been after the prophet's death? To this question, Muqatil responds, he would have been a prophet. The commentator now moves from the general to the specific. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that Zayd, who was a man, had continued to be Muhammad's son and that he had outlived his father. In that case, Muqatil explains, it's a canon of Eden. Zayd would have been a prophet. Muqatil's assertion that Zayd was a potential prophet is, in my view, remarkable and perhaps unique within the entirety of the Islamic tradition. After Muqatil, you won't find that hypothetical repeated. Why would Muqatil make such a statement? Because he knew the Qur'an backwards and forwards. And the Qur'an repeatedly states that the office of prophecy is the exclusive possession of a single divinely privileged lineage, the LEA, or progeny of Abraham. Beginning with Abraham, all the biblical figures identified in the Qur'an as prophets are members of this family. Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and so on down the line. And finally, Muhammad himself. In the Quranic worldview, the office of prophecy is transmitted from father to son. It follows that if Muhammad did have a son who attained physical maturity and outlived his father, the office of prophecy would have passed to that son and to his lineal descendants. In that case, however, Muhammad would not have been the last prophet. Conversely, if Muhammad was the last prophet, he could not be remembered as having a son, either biological or adopted, who attained physical maturity and outlived him.